a quarter of the world's population is now living under some form of lockdown due to coronavirus. More than 3 billion people in almost 70 countries and territories have been asked to stay at home. There are now more than 450,000 recorded cases of the virus globally, but we know that testing is not readily available in many places, so that number is likely to be much higher. So let's take a look at the situation across the globe. Let's focus on Spain, which has now recorded more coronavirus deaths than China. 738 people have died in just the past day. It takes the country's death toll to more than 3,400. Close to 50,000 people are now ill with this virus in Spain. More than 2,500 of them are in a serious or a critical state. Damien Grammaticus reports from Madrid.
On a dark day for Spain, a sobering sight. Van after van carrying bodies of virus victims. This is Madrid's biggest ice rink. It's been requisitioned to hold the dead. They need it. There are so many now. Arriving at Spanish hospitals are more and more cases. Infections here leaping every day. And more than 5,000 medical staff have fallen sick too. So part of Spain's urgent efforts are these new rapid testing centres, specifically for those in the front line. Toñi Osuna, a nurse, fears she has the virus. A colleague has it. The swabs are invasive, unpleasant, handled with extreme care in case they've picked up the pathogen.
I'm very worried, especially for my family and my patients. At home I stay in one room, isolated, treating myself for my symptoms alone.
A huge amount of concern there. Well, the Spanish government has asked the EU for protective equipment for its medical workers, as Gavin Lee reports.
What we're talking about is 1.5 million face masks, 500,000 respirators, 500,000 fast emergency testing kits, hundreds of ventilators. And now this will have to go to EU countries and elsewhere, possibly China, to see what comes back. In the EU, they're going through a procurement program at the moment. It's in its early stages. There are reports that at the moment, it looks like countries combined could only provide around 10% of what's needed around the EU. So that's something that may take some time, but worrying for Spain today. Going across to Italy, where that figure is still the highest anywhere in terms of the death toll in the world, 70,000 cases, 7,000 deaths. Giuseppe Conte, the Prime Minister there, saying that they will look to increase now the penalties of people violating the strict lockdown there up to €4,000. And if you are in quarantine and you therefore breach that quarantine, you're looking at a possible 5-year jail sentence. So that's the severity that Italy is taking it now.
So, Gavin, they're mentioning Italy. This is, in fact, an Italian patient who is one of many who has, in fact, been transferred to a hospital in Germany. And it's because Italian hospitals are simply overrun. And Mark Lowen, our correspondent in Rome, has been tweeting the latest figures, saying that the daily increase in deaths has fallen slightly in Italy. It is down to still a shocking number of 683, but it is lower. So that means that for a fourth straight day, it is going down. A slower increase in the total number of currently infected, as he ends that hashtag hope. We've also been hearing that the head of the civil protection in Italy has a mild fever, and Mark also tweeting about that, saying, well, as if Italy needed more potent symbols of its difficulty, of its plight at the moment. The man who's charged with updating people about deaths across the country and new infections may himself have been flawed by this virus. So we'll keep you abreast of the situation there. Now, that lockdown remains in place in Italy, with authorities especially taking it extremely seriously. Authorities there using drones to check that people are adhering to the rules. In France, which has recorded more than 20,000 cases, President Emmanuel Macron has visited a field hospital in the eastern city of Mulhouse. Now, India is on its first day of a 3-week nationwide lockdown, and this is an image from Jammu State. This is police officers who have told people to crouch inside a marked circle in order to maintain a social distancing width between them after these allegedly broke a rule prohibiting gatherings of more than 3 people. Now, the country has also seen a sharp increase in cases in recent days, as Arundhati Mukherjee has reports from Delhi.
A message for all Indian citizens: stay indoors and stay safe, or else face not only health but legal consequences. Once bustling cities turned into ghost towns overnight as the country observes a complete lockdown. Only those doing the most essential jobs allowed on the streets. We came across this family of 4 who failed to get home before the lockdown.
No one is helping us. People are scared to give us a ride because of the virus. The police are also asking for our identity cards.
Desperate and worried for their children, they are having to cycle nearly 15 miles to get home. These were the scenes in Old Delhi as hundreds of homeless gathered, demanding food from authorities. Some fear hunger will kill them before coronavirus does. Others who were out to buy medicines and groceries told us the situation was challenging, but agreed a complete lockdown was needed to beat the virus.
There's no stock, no vegetable, nothing. Our daily needs are also not getting met. Milk, I didn't find milk, bread for my people at home.
This is good that Prime Minister Modi has enforced a lockdown. It's the only way forward.
These are unprecedented scenes in a country of 1.3 billion people, unimaginable before this crisis. Many observers say that only a politician like Narendra Modi could take and implement such a drastic step.
India has tested fewer people than most other countries. The virus is already likely to have spread in far greater number than officially recognized. For the world's second most populous country, disaster could still be ahead.
So as people have to stay at home, deliveries are increasingly important, but we're getting reports that deliveries of food and medicine are in fact being hampered by the police. This is a tweet from the editor of the Economic Times, which talks about police brutality against people who are trying to deliver food and medicines, and basically saying that there is a lack of understanding about what essential services are. And she attached these photos, which are quite gruesome actually. These are purportedly of a driver of a delivery person who was beaten by local authorities. So that's the situation in India. Now, I want to take you to Russia because underneath this visor, this mask, is Vladimir Putin. And the president has announced next week will be a non-working week in Russia, except for key services. He's also postponed a nationwide vote on constitutional changes, which would allow him to extend his rule because of the worsening ongoing situation with coronavirus. Now, Russia's total number of cases has passed 600 with a record daily rise, as Steve Rosenberg explains from Moscow.
Well, in Russia, according to official figures, the number of confirmed coronavirus cases is relatively low. It's in the hundreds compared with tens of thousands in Italy, which is really surprising when you consider that Russia is a massive country. But they are preparing for an influx of patients, including here at the city's main emergency hospital, where they've converted a whole section to the battle against COVID-19. Well, this is the green zone, the safe zone to be in. It's actually the cardiological department of the hospital. But because of the pandemic, what they've done here is to repurpose one of the units for coronavirus patients. What they say here is that they have all the facilities, all the equipment they need to treat people. So if we look over here, this is where the patients who have suspected COVID-19 are brought in. As you can see, everyone's in protective gear. It took them 3 days to set up this area, and they've put in 80 beds here. You can see some of the beds here, and they're all full.
The situation is serious, but it is not a catastrophic situation.
Why do you think the official figures are quite low in Russia for people with coronavirus?
If all people who have mild signs of infection, cough, maybe runny nose, would make tests, the number of people with coronavirus would be much more.
So the message from this hospital, at least, is everything's under control. But Russia is the largest country in the world, with a healthcare system which for years has been underfunded and under enormous pressure. Coronavirus is a huge challenge for everyone, including Russia.
It certainly is. Well, the United Nations has launched a humanitarian response plan. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, says that the world is only as strong as its weakest health system and that the developing world will need more support to prevent infections spiraling out of control.
Be responsible, be smart, but above all, understand that only with solidarity we can defeat this disease.
Now, as we heard, at least a quarter of the world's population are now down on a lockdown. And I want to show you a particular map that shows you just how quickly the measures are spreading, these lockdown measures are spreading. The darker colours that you're looking at show the heavier restrictions. So basically green represents where schools are closed, through to the dark blue images where there's a full lockdown, especially there in Europe, as you can see. This was an image a week ago, so let's have a look at how that compares to what is going on now. Typically, the map will, there you go. So this really contrasts. You saw Australia was green earlier, now it's blue and very much dark across large swathes of Europe. You can see that over 30 countries here have now told their citizens that they must shelter in place, which basically means stay at home. Now, the question is how long these measures will last. If we look at the calendar, well, Italy was the first country to lock down on the 9th of March. That was supposed to be for 4 weeks. The government has already said that it wants to extend beyond that. Spain went, well, it went just a few days later, initially for 15 days, although the government already there proposing to make it 30 days, warning that the worst is yet to come. So as April approaches after March, there is just no sign of those lockdowns ending. The UK acted a little bit later. Its measures are for 3 weeks. One country that has been able to scale back is China, however. This was Wednesday morning there, with bus services being resumed in Wuhan, the city, of course, where this outbreak began. They've had 9 weeks of shutdown there. Now, it's still under tight control, although some travel in and around the city is increasingly being allowed. Steve McDonald explains from Beijing.
Here at Beijing West train station, it's a highly symbolic day as travellers from Hubei arrive in the Chinese capital. The province where this global emergency started has lifted its lockdown and people there are now able to travel to other parts of the country. Now, as you look around here, you can see all these buses have been parked to receive passengers as they come in. That's because you still have to do quarantine when you get into Beijing. That might seem like a hassle, but for these people who've been cooped up for months, it's another step towards normality. A couple of weeks of quarantine, then they can go back to work here. There's been a lot of debate about the figures here and whether or not the official count can be trusted in terms of how many people are actually infected in China. Well, there's a feeling that the national government wouldn't be allowing travellers to arrive here in Beijing, where they live, unless they felt that this emergency was pretty much under control.
Now, let's turn to the United States, because Democrats in the Senate have reached agreement with the White House on a stimulus package worth $2 trillion. It's going to be the largest bailout program in history, and it includes sending checks of $1,200 to every adult except for high earners. Now, there's also hundreds of billions of dollars in loans for businesses, even for state governments if they need a bailout. Let's cross over to Washington. Anthony Zerka is also self-isolating, and you've been across this for us. Anthony, finally agreement on this stimulus package.
Finally an agreement. They've been battling over this for days now. They had to extend the voting deadline several times, but it looks like we're getting close to the final stretch here. There's a little bit of objections coming from some Republican senators over the size of the unemployment payouts that could be going towards individuals, but I imagine that will be worked out fairly soon. Remember, the Senate is going to pass this first, then it's going to be passed by the House of Representatives. All of the members of Congress, of which are scattered all over the country right now, they're going to have to either do this by a unanimous consent vote or fly back into D.C. and vote on it. It will be probably towards the end of the week before this could be approved by Congress, and at that point it would end up on Donald Trump's desk for his signature.
Anthony, don't go away, because I want to talk to you a little bit later about the situation in New York. But I just want to add that all companies controlled by President Trump and his kids are banned from receiving any loans or investments from this huge stimulus package that's designed to make it impossible for the president to channel any of this taxpayer money into Trump-branded resorts or hotels. There are questions whether this and the fact that he's hinged his re-election in November on a booming economy could be a factor in him calling for the lockdown to end after just 15 days. Here he is saying that.
Easter is a very special day for many reasons. For me, for a lot of our friends, that's a very special day. And what a great timeline this would be. Easter as our timeline, what a great timeline that would be.
So he's aiming for Easter, but that's despite the fact that there are more than 55,000 cases in the US, with the number of deaths at almost 900. And the WHO has warned that the US could in fact become the virus's next epicenter. And New York's governor has warned that the illness is spreading faster than a bullet train. Let's go back to Anthony. It just seems that the president is incredibly optimistic, given what we're seeing in reality, the figures coming especially from New York State.
Right, it does seem very optimistic, and the administration walked back those comments a little bit yesterday evening. Donald Trump's medical advisor said that that was a goal, but not necessarily. It was a flexible kind of a deadline that they could be looking at. And you have to remember, you mentioned New York Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo. The governors are going to be the ones who have the final say in this. And so conceivably, if Donald Trump keeps pushing to have businesses reopen, he could be in direct conflict with governors all over this country who have decided in their judgment to keep businesses closed. Now, that could put Donald Trump in a position of saying, well, if there are economic consequences from these closures, he's the one trying to open things up and get American businesses booming and not take quite as much of the blame as, say, governors might. That would be a position he could conceivably campaign on. You have to remember, over the past year and a half, Donald Trump has been talking about this great economy as his biggest accomplishment and what makes him deserving of re-election. So he has to bank on some sort of either a recalibration of his message or the economy bouncing back pretty quickly if he wants to keep that kind of a message going into the general election in November.
Anthony, just in a sentence, when it comes to how the mood is, what are people thinking about the way Donald Trump is reacting to all of this? Very briefly.
Well, if you look at the polls, Donald Trump actually has seen some of his highest approval ratings. People seem to be rallying around him for the moment. The question is whether that will continue as these negative consequences drag on for weeks and months ahead.